Welcome to the Business of Podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Melanie Brucks as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Melanie serves as an assistant professor of business at Columbia Business School. She explores the science of creativity and innovation. Her research dwells into how individuals and teams generate and evaluate novel ideas and how emerging technologies shape our cognitive and behavioral patterns in the creative process. By uncovering this mechanism, her work guides marketers and organizations in designing more effective ideation practices that inspire breakthrough thinking. Prior to joining Columbia, Dr. Bruce earned her PhD in marketing from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. In today's conversation, Dr. Melanie Brooks discusses key insights from her research, clicks, drags, and whips. When taking digital surveys, your moments matter. She explains how subtle differences in survey interfaces can influence people's responses and how those small effects can accumulate in meaningful ways. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Melanie Brooks to the conversation. Dr. Melanie, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Professor, what initially sparked your curiosity about how physical movements like clicking and dragging might shape people's responses to digital surveys?
So it happened a bit by accident. So I was really interested in how technology has changed or increased the number of options that we have for how to interact with things. So for example, you can scan a fingerprint now, or you can drag and drop something on your computer screen. And so I was talking to my advisor at the time. I was a PhD student, and one of my advisors, Jonathan Lvov, mentioned that one really cool area of this are surveys. If you think about it, more than almost any other industry, surveys have been completely disrupted by the digitization. So before, like 20 years ago, all surveys were on like a piece of paper. If you were asked how extroverted are you? How social and outgoing are you from 1 to 7? You would look on a piece of paper and just circle a number, and that was the only way that people could do this. Now, almost all surveys happen using some kind of digital interface. So initially, we just ran like this really big experiment where we manipulated all different kinds of ways people could use surveys just to see, are there any differences in the different response options that we now have? And one thing that popped out was this difference between using a slider and a radio button. But at first, I didn't think that it was very interesting because one obvious difference between a slider, which is an anchored thing that you drag across, is that it has a starting point. Whereas a radio button, when you just have like all these different circles underneath, doesn't have a starting point normally. So I thought, this is just anchoring on a starting point. That's not very interesting. So we reran it where we held that constant. So now both of them have this starting point. And the only difference now is the physical movement. And when we found that that also, replicated the same effect, we thought we had something cool.
Professor, in your early conversations with Dr. Levau, what made you realize that kinesthetic factors could be a missing piece in understanding survey design?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that we tend to forget is that even with technology, we're still physical beings. So a lot of work in the physical world looks at how our physicality interacts with the environment. So one of my favorite books that I teach in class that I was looking over in preparation for today is Why We Buy. And it talks about all the different ways the physical um, requirements, the physical attributes of a shopping space affect our behavior and how that interacts with our own physicality. So, for example, when you walk into a grocery store or a different kind of store, we often instinctually turn right. Most people do. And so that means the things that are on the right side of a shopping center are more likely to get purchased. Now, what's interesting is that when we've moved online, we kind of forget that this physicality still exists, that we still are physical beings and we're still engaging in movements, and that will still be affecting us psychologically as we're interacting with different digital things. So when we found this difference between sliders and radio buttons and realized it isn't about a starting point, there seems to be something else, we thought this might be an example of how we've ignored or neglected the physicality of, um, of our interactions.
Professor, could you walk us through how something as small as dragging a slider versus clicking a radio button can subtly influence how people think and respond?
Yeah, so let's start with a concrete example because things can get kind of abstract. Um, like I mentioned before, imagine you're filling out a personality survey and you've been asked, how extroverted are you? So, how social, how outgoing are you? Can you answer this from a one, not at all, to a seven, very much scale? Now, we all have a sense of our personality, but we probably don't have a number stored in our head, right? And so, what we need to do is we need to construct a response. Basically, take maybe the memories that we have or the narratives that we have, and then think about that and then translate that to where that is on a scale. Now, when you're using a radio button, and just remember that these are different options with little circles underneath each one, um, that is going to require two steps. You first need to think, where do I fall? You might think, okay, I'm around a four, and then you need to go to the four and click on it. What's interesting about a slider with dragging motion is that you can integrate the consideration part and the answering part. So, for example, if I ask you how extroverted you are and you see a slider, you can drag past each option and kind of consider it and then stop when you respond. And what we find is this different sequence, this using the scale as you're forming a response compared to forming a response and then using the scale can elicit different attentional patterns. So in other ways, you're literally going to process it differently depending on how you're moving to indicate your response.
Dr. Brooks, the whipping behavior sounds fascinating and unexpected. How did you uncover it? And what might it reveal about decisiveness or certainty in responses?
Yes. So, just to quickly summarize what we initially found and then how we found the whipping effect. So, what we find is when you're dragging past each option as you're responding, that's going to bring your attention to each of these options. And there's work that shows that just simply by attending to something, you're more likely to select it. So, back to this work again from why we buy. I mean, this is really where we're basing our work on all the physical work that came before it. If you have like a label in front of you that's more attention grabbing, you're more likely to buy that label. Things that are around eye level, you're more likely to attend to, you're more likely to buy. So taking that same knowledge we have from the physical space, we bring it into the digital space. That simply by attending to these options as you're dragging past them, you're more likely to select them. So it leads you to select responses that are closer to the starting point because you've attended to each one as you've dragged past it. And what we were arguing is this attention is driven by physical movement. So our relationship between movement and attention was established when we're babies. And that makes sense, right? If you're holding something, it makes sense you should attend to it more. If you're walking somewhere, it makes sense you should attend to your environment. It makes sense that our movement is what we attend to. So if we're right that dragging a slider is making us attend more to these options, then when people are clicking rather than dragging, we shouldn't observe the effect anymore. And we were using Qualtrics as our survey platform, and they have a slider that allows you to click. So it's basically a slider. It has like an end button. You could either drag it or you could just go and click here or click here. And so that lets us hold the exact same image constant, and the only differences are you dragging or clicking. The problem was there was no way to actually capture using Qualtrics whether or not they were dragging or clicking. So we collaborated with someone at Stanford Business School, David Perlman. He's amazing. Shout out to him. He developed custom JavaScript to help us capture, are they dragging or are they clicking a scale? And the way we did that is we had to basically draw like a box around the question because we don't want to count like a click at a next button or a click somewhere else as responding. And then we looked at, does the click start and end in the same spot? So if you just basically click down and then release in the same spot, we'd count that as a click. If you click down somewhere, but then click up or end in a different spot, that counted as a drag. So I was like, great, we're done. We've made this great JavaScript. Now we can observe. And so we ran a study and we found that like a subset of people, like around 8% of people, were not being measured on either. They were saying you didn't click or drag. And we are like, something's wrong. So I contacted David and I was like, I think something's up with the JavaScript. It failed to record all these people. And so then we just started playing around with it and trying a bunch of different things to try to understand what happened. And we realized this stumbled upon that there's a third way in which people respond to these things. It's actually really interesting because it makes a really big difference in how they think about the question and how they respond and what their eventual response is. And that is, they do something we ended up calling whipping. Um, and we had a hard time deciding exactly what to call this. It's a very specific motion. It's basically you click down initially within the question box, but then you kind of go, and you're not going past each option. It's kind of like this imprecise swipe. And when they do that, their cursor ends up outside of the question because they weren't going through the question. They kind of just went like this. It's, kind of akin to maybe what people would do like on Tinder or something where you're just like swiping and you don't have to care about anything in between. It's just like a movement. And what we discovered is people, once we were able to capture that, so basically you click down within the question, but you end your response outside of the question box. So you're way over, on the side of the page. These people are much more likely to use end responses. And they also are responding quite quickly. And so they're not considering each of these options as they go by, and they look completely different than the people who are doing that. They're instead kind of engaging in this, oh, I'm at the end of this scale. I'm not even going to think about it. So it was a complete, accident to find it, but it's actually a really interesting one to realize that there's, people are going to interact with things the way that they naturally do. And so we need to be considering this when we're developing UX. Like, I don't necessarily think that Qualtrics was considering that this is another thing people might do with the sliders. And so that's one of the, the lessons of this is observe people when they're interacting with digital technology and observe what is their physicality, how are they doing this, because I can give you insight or a window into their psychology behind their response.
Professor, given your findings, how should marketers, UX designers, and behavioral scientists rethink the way they build digital feedback tools?
Yeah, so that's a great question because we really see this work as a call to action. So this is just one specific thing. We're looking at sliders and radio buttons, and you could argue, I think, it's obviously very practically important given the number of online surveys people collect all the time. But it's, a little bit narrow and a very specific type of question you could do. But really, we see this as a call to action for thinking more intentionally about physical movements and how they might not be psychologically benign. I think that often when we're making these decisions, I certainly know before I started this project, when I would create a survey, I never explicitly considered how the different decisions I make and the kinds of question formats that I have could make a psychological difference that could actually affect how people were thinking about the question. And I generally perceive that this is the way in which people are thinking about UX and about like more the aesthetic part is not that it's going to change fundamentally how people are processing things, just it might be easier to use or it might be more engaging. And so we hope this kind of brings attention back to this space, kind of harkening back to what I said before. that we are physical beings, and just because we're interacting in a digital space does not remove the fact that physicality matters for us. So kind of bringing that back into our understanding of digital behavior is kind of our goal more broadly.
Professor, you mentioned that small differences can accumulate into big effects. Could you share an example of how this plays out in real world applications like customer reviews or employee surveys?
Yeah, so we thought a lot about this because I have to mention that our effect size, you could argue, is kind of small. So, for example, going back to the 1 to 7 scale for extroversion, we might get a difference of like zero point 0.2. So maybe the radio button is 4.6 and the slider is 4.4. And you might argue, does that even matter? This seems like a pretty trivial finding, and we think there's several reasons why this does matter. The first is oftentimes people use scales as a metric for performance or a metric for the success of something. And they take it at face value. So, for example, if you have a 1 to 5 scale and 5 is, completely satisfied, anything below that means there is opportunity to improve. And sometimes consequential decisions are made this way. So, for example, Eric Johnson, my colleague here, he has a book that shows that people are kicked off the Uber app once you're a driver if you're below 4.6. And so even, they've treated this almost like this is a threshold that means something, and if something's below that threshold, that means that you're not meeting a standard that we have. And what we find is there's a little bit of arbitrariness to responses based on the physical movements they're engaging in. And so you might be kicking people off a platform simply because you had a scale that could bias people towards the lower end. Or you might think customers aren't satisfied, we need to be making changes. Well, if you use a slider scale, maybe part of the lack of satisfaction is just because you bias their attention towards those lower numbers. So I think it matters when people are using these metrics as a proxy for like descriptively understanding what's happening out in the world. The other thing that I think is also interesting is sometimes the actual behavior is literally the slider or the radio button. So my favorite example of this that I encountered in my daily life is the opportunity to bid to get like an upgrade. So for example, I had a flight once and I got an email being like, do you want to bid to go into first class or business class? And they gave me a slider. And it started with like, some $20 and then you could go up from there. And what I think is happening in these cases is you are going to be anchoring people on those lower values because they're going to be attending to them as they're sliding. And so if they simply switch this to a radio button scale, my guess is people would bid more money on upgrading. And even if each individual bid is only $5 more on average, that's across all the people who are doing this. And these are just basically a pretty trivial decision in UX that could get you, potentially thousands of dollars or more each time you're launching these surveys. So, I think the effect size is small, but it means a lot when you're looking at this aggregate scale. And also, there isn't that much cost to picking one or another. So, given that it's pretty costless to either implement a slider or a radio button, I think it's worth thinking a little bit about because these small differences are still going to add up to something.
Professor, in your view, could intentionally choosing different interfaces like sliders instead of buttons help researchers counteract non-biases such as score inflation?
Yeah, so I really like this question because um, it's kind of an interesting way where you can use this bias in your favor. So just as a reminder, what we're arguing is as you're dragging a slider, it's bringing your attention towards these earlier options, and that is a bias because you're doing undue attention on these options. You otherwise would not have attended to them as much as you did, and that brings you towards those responses. However, this bias and attention could be good if you're counteracting a different bias. And one bias that is well known in the survey and review space is review inflation. So people basically will give 5 stars on Yelp regardless the experience. And then that is actually a problem for Yelp because now there's no differentiation between different places. And so this is actually a challenge that a lot of online review aggregators suffer from. And one thing that a slider could do to help counteract that bias is by directing attention to his lower values. So, for example, if I ask like how was your experience at this restaurant, and I force you to drag past 1 star and drag past 2 stars, you're now momentarily considering the possibility that you might not give 5 stars, and you're giving attention to these lower values. And that could lead people to be more likely to give those responses. And one thing that's interesting is we find that our effect only happens when people have uncertainty. So, for example, if I asked you, you know, did you shower yesterday? Yes or no? It doesn't matter if you're dragging or clicking, you know the answer. You're just going to give the same response. But if things that people don't really know what their answers are, that's when it's going to have more of an effect. So if you had a phenomenal, amazing dinner, it shouldn't matter if you pass by 1 and 2 stars. You know you want to give 5 stars. But if you had a good dinner and you normally just would have clicked 5, but now you're asked to kind of think about these other options, you're more likely to give a 4 or a 3, whereas you wouldn't have before. So you can actually use this bias and attention and bringing people towards the other side of the scale to infuse more meaningful variance in responses where people might otherwise just be giving like a 5.
Professor, as people increasingly communicate judgments through digital tools, how do you see this research informing the broader conversation about how humans express themselves through technology?
Yeah, I think that this reminds me of, what I've been saying before, which is that the broader conversation just has not involved physicality. It's not something we think about. And people are bringing it up now as we're starting to integrate technology into more clearly physical environments. So, for example, AR, augmented reality, is now in our physical space. But so much of what we do is still we're ignoring the physicality of it. So, for example, one thing I was thinking about was phone use. There's so much conversation about how we're spending too much time on our phones. A lot of talk about how this might be affecting kids in particular. How social media has these negative impacts, not on our attention, but also maybe on our well-being. And I was talking to some students about this a while ago, and they mentioned, "Oh, do you have that little bump on your finger?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And they're like, "You can tell how often people hold their phone because people literally are getting divots in their finger from where they're like holding their phone when they're watching things." And there's also, from a medical perspective, issues of people's necks too, because we're now, constantly like this rather than facing forwards, leading to more neck issues, more postural issues. And you just don't see people talk about the physicality, how we're holding our phones, what are we doing with our bodies as we are consuming this content as part of what's affecting our psychology. I think this is true in all the ways in which we use our technology, and we just don't talk about them. And so I'm hoping this is really contributing to this broader conversation by highlighting a neglected attribute of digital consumption and how that might be having important impacts on the behaviors that we care about that we're not really considering. So I'm really just hoping to increase awareness, and if nothing else, just make people more intentional and explicit about their decisions when they think about the physicality of digital interactions.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. What's next frontier for you in studying the intersection of movement, attention, and digital behavior? Are there other digital interfaces you are excited to explore?
Yes, thank you for asking that because the other area that I've been really interested in is virtual interaction. For example, communicating like we are right now on Zoom, and how, again, this physicality can be affecting our attention and our interactions. And when we have seen prior work on virtual communication, it again is a lot to do with information transfer. So, for example, if I'm talking on the phone, you can't see my facial expressions. If I'm sending you an email, you can't hear my vocal tone. But what's really cool about right now, what we're doing is like you can see my facial expressions, you can hear my voice. It's all happening in real time. This is in many ways very similar in terms of information to face to face. I'm not really missing much information cues. But I think again, this literature has missed out on the physicality of the interaction that happens online versus in person. So, for example, one thing that I've been exploring is how this could matter in teaching. So, when I teach in person, certain people take up more space in my environment. And there's different ways you can do that. Like some people are literally just taller or physically larger, but other people just use up more space. Like you might kind of sit like this, or you might kind of sit like this, and that really changes how much attention I'm going to pay to you because you are just more visually salient in my space when you do that. But when you're on Zoom, for example, everyone is like the same exact size on your screen. They all get the same box. So you've almost removed a physicality cue that we used to have when we were interacting in person that no longer exists online. And how could that change group dynamics? How could that change meetings that we have? How does that change who might participate in those meetings or how someone might lead those meetings? I think that's really interesting. The other thing in the same vein of digital interaction that I think is interesting is shared environment and how that difference in physicality can have an impact. So right now, we're not in the same physical space. And so my attention is mostly on you and the screen because everything else around me is irrelevant to you. You can't see it, you're not interacting with it. And I have a paper that shows that because of this, we look much more at the person and we look much less at our surrounding environment. And so, one thing I want to follow up on is how this attentional difference that's due to the physicality of interacting, where now it's only here and nothing else, can have downstream implications. So, for example, I think one thing that's interesting is physical environments provide memory cues. They're different things that we can kind of latch onto and can help make the memory and the experience richer in terms of the things that happen during it. Whereas if you're communicating on Zoom, like the only thing you're really paying attention to is the interaction and nothing else. And so, how does it affect memory? How does it affect how we recall the interactions that we've had before? How does this affect, what things are most salient to us during the experience and what we later recall about it? So, I think that that's another example where the physicality of the digital interaction has been kind of ignored, but it's really interesting, I think. And so that's, where I'm going next.
Thank you, Dr. Melanie Brooks, for sharing such fascinating insights into how the simple act of clicking and dragging can shape the way we think and respond. Your research is a powerful reminder that even small design choices can have meaningful impacts. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me, Deepak.